If you clicked, and thanks by the way, then you know that we're talking about repetition and variation and the way these two principles can work together to make your writing better. And that's easy enough to say, but today I want to show you how they actually work, and not only that, but how they may be the key, not just to more interesting writing, but maybe to better art, no matter what medium you're working in. But first, let's just make sure that we know what I mean when I say repetition and variation. So, of course, repetition involves anything that shows up more than once in your writing. You can repeat words, like with anaphora, where the first word in a string of sentences is the same. You can repeat sounds, like with rhyme or alliteration. You can repeat grammatical units, like with a trio of participial phrases at the end of a sentence. And you could also think about repetition in broader terms, referring to anything that contributes a sense of consistency to your work. So a consistently serious tone or consistently colloquial diction may not involve the repetition of discrete units, but it can, at least for the sake of our discussion today, still be a kind of repetition. It's an aspect of your writing that shows up more than once and throughout a piece. So when we're talking about repetition, we're talking about consistency, about setting up certain patterns in your writing and sticking to them. Which then means variation is anything you might do that doesn't fit a pattern or that disrupts a pattern that's already been established. It's inconsistency, deviation, or surprise. Now, you probably noticed that these two principles, which are both good principles to follow in your writing, are at odds with each other. Like most things people tell you to do in your writing, these principles are in tension. You just can't have both operating at 100%.
Okay, then just one or the other. How about this? Behold, fearful youth, and trip on how far out my drip is. And don't you just love vanquishing your enemies, cool drinks on a hot summer day, and my friends are missing?
Well, that certainly is a sentence with high variation. You've got, some wild inconsistencies of tone and formality, some generationally inconsistent slang, the appearance of a three-part list of parallel phrases that are actually all structured in really different ways that are all about different things, and that's not to say anything about the hard pivot in subject matter partway through. It's kind of hard to know where to start.
Oh, just start by saying it's great and I'm great. It's not really that hard now, is it, bud?
Well, it's just that sentence is a lot, probably too much for most readers. With such a high degree of variation, it's hard to know what that sentence is about, how it works, or what it's even trying to do. It's doing so much that it ends up not really doing anything at all. Some readers might think it's funny, others might say it's interesting, but you'd probably struggle to find readers who say that it's good.
Wow. And I'm saying this as a mind reader. You sure are hard to please, bud.
Hey, I'm just saying, too much variation can be disorienting or off-putting. But it's not an either-or thing. Too much consistency can have its issues too. A paragraph where every sentence has the same structure is hurtling towards the limits of its reader's tolerance for boredom. This is a video. This video is about writing. This video is about repetition. This video is about variation. This video has some examples. This video says repetition is good. This video says variation is good. This video says repetition can be bad. This video says variation can be bad. And you get the idea, but a little variation in that overly repetitive style can go a long way. This video about writing focuses on repetition and variation. It gives examples of how repetition and variation can be good, but it also warns about how they can be bad. Not the greatest paragraph ever written, but so much less monotonous than the original. Or on a smaller scale, the pitfalls of over-the-top repetition begin to be not just boring, but also cartoonish and ridiculous when your alliteration is overly faithful. Silly songsters sang 7 senseless songs Saturday, soundly sullying several celebrations. In contrast, those silly singers sang some ridiculous songs last night and thoroughly ruined several celebrations in the process, gives us a strong alliterative effect, with some moments of rest from the sibilant onslaught, as well as a little bit of palate-cleansing repetition of an alternate sound, and then even some interesting repetition of the S sound somewhere other than at the start of words. It's still fun, but without being overbearing. But those are exaggerated forms of repetition. Most writers probably wouldn't be doing things like that, and our friends at the Quintillian Institute of Words About Words have done several presentations on classical figures of repetition. So there's a long, strong history of adding deliberate and overt repetition to enhance your style. Adding some thoughtful repetition like that can make your writing feel more controlled, more mannered, or more deliberate. There's a certain refinement to moderate repetition, so much so that at least when it comes to repetition of grammatical structures, typically called parallelism, repetition can become an expectation rather than an enhancement. I like to read, to write, and to orate is good, solid, parallel structure. But I like to read, writing, and orating is a dire mistake that anyone would shove you in a locker for. But then, take something like this. Students, please put away your phones, focus your attention, and do your best. That's classic parallel structure, classic three-part repetition. Nobody would ever complain about this, and it would be a nice way to show your understanding of grammar and your control of language. But what if we added a dash of variation, an intentional bending of the expected repetition with something like this? Students, put away your phones, focus your attention, and please, for once, would it be so bad if a flicker of human emotion showed in your eyes? Stop, some might say. That's not parallel structure, and they would be right. The third part of this list has a wildly different structure from its neighbors. But rather than being a lack of control, it's a deliberate rhetorical choice that creates a different character. It's a kind of eruption of exasperation that overflows the mannerly pattern that precedes it. And it's possible through a combination of repetition and variation. And really, this is the same principle that pushes chefs to drizzle acid on rich dishes, or that has composers writing dissonant chords in the middle of pleasant melodies, or that encourages interior designers to paint 3 walls white and 1 wall green. Repetition and variation, consistency and contrast, tension and resolution. Call them what you will, but the more I pay attention, the more I see them at work in any art. Now, how much you disrupt that pattern, or where you land on the spectrum between strict repetition and wild variation, is more a matter of taste than of rules. But it's worth remembering that an accent wall can be visually interesting, but it's only possible if every other wall is painted one color. You need enough repetition to make the variation meaningful. You can't disrupt a pattern without first establishing a pattern. But set up a reliable pattern and twist it in a surprising way, and you can do a lot to add interest and flair to your writing style. But it's not just style. Sure, you can pay attention to the repetition and variation in the sounds and structures of your words and sentences, but what if we applied these principles to the larger design of your work? Not long ago, I was working with a client who had written an essay in 3 parts, and as I was giving them feedback on their draft, I found myself asking questions that really boiled down to a matter of repetition and variation. Now, the first 2 parts of the essay were really similar. They talked about the same material in nearly the same way. But the third part stood out as being very different in tone, content, and style. A classic example of repetition and variation, you might say.
Well, yeah, because you've taught us that, unless you've been lying to us this whole time and you don't actually mean what you say.
Hang on, it's not lying if I'm just adding nuance, right?
Whatever helps you sleep at night.
Nothing does. Anyway, as I read that essay, I was asking myself these questions. Are the first 2 sections different enough to be different sections? And is the third section similar enough to be part of the same piece? As written, that essay was in a kind of in-between state. As a reviewer, I was torn between wanting the sections to be more consistent and wanting them to be more different. Maybe, for simplicity's sake, we could think of the structure of the essay in terms of colors and geometry. So here's the structure of the draft I was reviewing. Illustrated this way, it's pretty clear that one of these sections doesn't quite belong with the others. Yes, it's different. It's a clear variation on the theme, but it's also so different that the entire piece no longer feels cohesive. It's less a charming variation and more a total departure from the expectation the rest of the piece sets. It's maybe like cooking a magnificent lasagna and then topping it with blueberry pie filling. That is a variation on the theme of lasagna, but it's probably too different to work. So, like I said, a revision could go in more than one way. Maybe the sections become more similar, maybe like this. Or maybe they become more different. In either case, the goal is to create enough repetition or enough consistency that the piece feels like one piece, while still including enough variation that each part deserves to be its own part. Yes, we want the variation, but we should support it with enough consistency that all the pieces still feel like they belong. So you could, for example, add some acidic contrast to your chocolate cake, but raspberries, limes, and malt vinegar just don't do that job interchangeably. You want a contrast, but you also want a harmonious contrast. So then an essay or a poem or a 3-act play arranged like this is probably going to be boring and predictable. But that same piece arranged like this is probably going to be disjointed, disorienting, and who knows, maybe even disreputable. You have, of course, all kinds of options for how you might structure the work, but those decisions can and probably should be guided by the principles of repetition and variation. Repetition buys you cohesion, and variation buys you interest. So as you revise, you could look at each paragraph in your essay, each poem in your collection, or each chapter in your novel, and ask yourself this. First, does this part have enough in common with the rest of the work that it feels like it belongs? And second, is this part different enough from all the others to stand on its own? Maybe you end up with 2 poems in your collection that really cover similar ground, so you probably don't need both. Maybe there's a way to combine them, or easier yet, just cut one of them. Or maybe there's a poem that you're really proud of, but it just doesn't fit tonally or stylistically with the rest of the poems. It can be a good poem and not be a good fit for that book. So maybe it's better to say repetition with harmonious variation, but you get the idea. Whether we're talking about sentences or book series, too much repetition is as much a liability as too much variation. So practicing both and finding your own harmonious middle ground will do a lot to elevate your writing in the same way that a judicious dash of acid could do a lot to elevate a dish.
Which is honestly why I have to put in so much work on this show.
Whatever helps you sleep at night. Okay, my mistake. But speaking of things that aren't mistakes, thank you for joining us today. It was, as always, a pleasure to chat. We've got more good stuff on the way for next week, so take care till next time, and we'll see you again soon.